That's lovely. Okay, so today I thought we'd look at something that is eerily present, eerily similar to the present. And just so that I can see everything I've got on my screen, I've made your faces very, very small. If you want to say anything or bring anything to my attention, please yell, because I won't be able to see you waving at me. If you do the raise hand thing, I'm likely to see that.
One interjection, this is clearly a very ancient map.
Very, very ancient, yes.
because the Shetland Islands have not yet been discovered.
Oh, very good, yes. That's an excellent point, Andrea. And also, Southern Ireland has not been discovered either, if you look. I'll tell you about this map because I find it a source of fascination, but let's get to the context of it first. So that's a teaser. So I show you the map and then I say, yes, but I'm not going to show you that just now. I'm going to show you something different. Ha. So we're looking at this time when there were massive migrations. And this is the time when Roman Britain had come to some kind of a fearful end. And we don't really know, or we haven't known for many years, what that end quite was, what it looked like, how it rolled out. What we do know from the archaeology is that things were happening that made the occupants of Britain fearful. And you see this, for example, because these gigantic defensive forts were built towards the second half of the time of Roman occupation. They're known by a generic term, which is Saxon shore forts. Just as an aside, during the late part of Roman Britain, an actual military general's post was created called the General or Count of the Saxon Shore. And they were in charge, presumably, of these sea defences. Sounds very familiar to 1945, 39-45, but there we go. And these, unlike most Roman forts, are actual defensive sites. They operated rather like later medieval castles. And indeed, I think you'll agree, they look like them, don't they? You know, they've got towers, they've got crenellations. And why did they have towers and crenellations? Well, I'll just show you there's a nice old photograph from of Portchester Castle near Portsmouth from the Historic England collection. The reason you can see from this shot why they have these bastions sticking out, particularly overlooking an estuary or a coastline, is that each one of those bastions would be occupied by a war machine, something like a trebuchet or an onager being Latin for a donkey, because it had a kick like a donkey. And these could fire projectiles of about 30 kilos or more, so the size of a heavy stuffed suitcase, out towards anybody trying to get in from the shore particularly. And I know what you're going to ask, which is the logical thing. If they were worried about people coming in from the shoreline, then why were there bastions facing the inland part? Ooh, well, we'd have to think about that on another day. So there was trouble happening. Another thing that shows us that trouble was happening is that all of the towns, not just in Roman Britain, but all the way across the Roman world, built thick walls, thick high walls around themselves. And they often seem to have built these thick high walls in something of a rush. Rather like the Berlin Wall in the 1960s, these encompassed other bits of architecture that were kind of in the way. If you go to Barcelona, for example, the wall there incorporates parts of a cemetery. It was all just sort of bunged together. And right, that's the wall, that's where we're having it. And these towns had heavily guarded gateways. So there were problems. There were problems happening, and these were the responses to the problems as the end part of the Roman Empire was coming along. Another interesting feature, which is much, much harder to pinpoint, harder to see archaeologically, but which we know was happening from the written records, was that people who were not Roman, or let's put it in modern parlance, not even recent arrivals in Roman provinces, these people from well outside the Roman world were being invited in to serve as security forces, so either part of the regular army or as mercenaries. And the thing is, there's a huge crossover in fashions and styles. Can you see the guys wearing trousers? Yeah? Trousers were a terrible, awful, barbarian thing. And they became high fashion in the Roman period. By the 300s, you've got to the point where the emperors are wearing trousers. Shock, horror. Ooh.
Maggie, it's only the men, because the women there seem to wear pink dresses.
Yes, in polyester as well. Yes, and leisure wear over on the left-hand side there near the spear. Good point, Matt. Matt's well made. Thank you for observing the photo. Reenactors are wonderful. If you've ever spent a lot of time around reenactors, it's a wonderful, wonderful world. Very dedicated people. So we have, if you like, these invisible people who we know they're there, but they can be very, very difficult to spot in the archaeology, almost impossible to spot. Now, the final break, we're told by historic writings that this happened, well, some people are quite firm about it and say it definitely did happen in 410. Now, you know that in archaeology we get a bit twitchy about precise years, so let's say it may have occurred in 410. It seems to be a consensus of opinion at the moment, but the young emperor of the time, a very beleaguered time it was for the Roman Empire, the capital had moved from Rome to Ravenna because the capital had been thoroughly kicked about by Visigoths and was no longer safe or deemed to be safe. But basically, with everything that was going on that they were facing on continental Europe, the decision was made that Britannia was a province too far. And we were very politely written to and told, thanks for all the tax, you're on your own. You must look to your own defences. It must have been quite something to receive that communication. Now,
Brexit won, perhaps, Maggie.
Again, Matt?
Brexit won.
It is definitely Brexit won. Yes, absolutely. So the written sources, which have been inflicted on generations and generations of scholars, say that Britannia, or what had been Britannia, then descended into awful chaos and terrible things happened. And this was what then became known as the Dark Ages. And that phrase, the Dark Ages, started to be used in the 1200s, as early as that. And it started to be used because of the writings that survived from this period. Now, none of the writings, if you just cast your eyes along the dates involved there, the earliest person's writing sometime in the 500s, then the 700s, then the 800s. I'm not giving you there a summary of the sources for the written sources, the historical sources for what happened at this point. I'm giving you all of them. So for the period from 400 or 410 to at least the 600s, that's a good 200 years. This is everything that's written historically that can be said to be a historical source. And I think you'll agree that there's a problem with that straight away, which is there's not enough of it. And if you look, they're all people coming from the only background that possessed writing at that time, which is the religious background. So
they're also writing about years before they were born.
exactly. It's like me writing about the Armada. What would I know about it? Nothing. Only what had been told. But they do agree on a couple of points. So let's at least they must have read each other's sources at some point. They agree that there were local rulers. They say that these local rulers have abandoned Christianity, or some of them did. They say that a mighty Christian leader managed to hold back the tide of pagan Saxons for a brief time. They say that in the middle part of the 400s, these Germanic mercenaries under specific named leaders, they're named here as Hengist and Horsa, which means horse and mare. So it's not taking us much further. So there we go. But Hengist and Horsa came over as mercenaries and then basically took over. They say that these were violent people, they were pagan, and they replaced the Christian Britons en masse. They say that the Christian Britons either fled or were killed or enslaved. And those two last points particularly, but all of the above, were the actual meat and drink of historical teaching until the 20th century. But the point is that physical evidence tells a slightly different story. And I'm going to start that physical evidence by looking at the map. Now, if you've got any questions at the moment and you want to ask them, do remember you can ask, you can yell out. I'll hear you if you yell. I'll know you're trying to get my attention. So we're back to this map. Now, this is already, Andrea said at the beginning, it's an old map, but it is an old map as these things go, because this is a study that happened 8 years ago now. I remember it as fresh as the day it was hatched. But there you go. It was produced a while ago. I haven't heard of a direct update of it since. I've heard of parts of it that have been worked on, but not the whole thing, because it was a very large scale study, as you can probably guess. They took a group of several thousand people who fulfilled certain ancestral criteria, and that was to do with how long their grandparents had lived in a specific area. And DNA testing of these people, these specimen people, produced this map. And the red on the map shows people whose DNA ancestry is largely, not mostly, about a third, so largely genetically identical to populations living in North Germany. And as you can see, that is an overwhelmingly large representation on the map. And that event can be plotted back through DNA analysis to a single series of actual migrations that occurred sometime after 400 and probably before 550. So you're looking at quite a concentrated number of, if you like, landings of people, landings of new people. And it's very rare in archaeology that these events can be proven to have happened. We know of 2 others that affect the British Isles, and they're both in distant prehistory. One is to do with the arrival of farming and farming technology, and the other is to do with the arrival of metallurgy, coppersmithing. And now we have this one that we know definitely did happen. And no matter what the actual historic writings say, this pattern of DNA reflects not a mass replacement of a previous population, but quite the opposite, a mass interaction. I hesitate to use the word interbreeding because it starts to sound slightly farmyardy or slightly eugenic-y. So I'm just avoiding it, but it's probably what I mean. If you can think of a better phrase, please do tell me what it is.
Maggie, can I just ask? Each individual shape there is that representing an individual sample? And if so, upon what basis does this diagram show these samples? Because obviously there's population centers that could be interpreted from these symbols, but is that the case?
Right, so that's exactly where the Wellcome Trust in this research has been very, very delicate about drawing a line. The Wellcome Trust is saying simply, this is what the DNA pattern shows, and this is how that DNA would come into being. So what we're looking at are, let's call it, wider familial patterns. Again, you'd say tribes, but I don't like, it's just me being picky. I don't like using the word tribe. I think it has connotations.
But are we interpreting that each symbol represents one perhaps personal family that they took the sample DNA from? And because in central Scotland, there was a population, but there were no symbols there, for instance.
Exactly, yeah.
So have they randomly picked these people, or how have they chosen who to sample?
The choosing was done in 2 ways. One is obviously the people who came forward, and the other is the people who fulfilled the criteria. And it was the criteria about how far back your ancestry could be traced within a specific 60-mile area. So it immediately becomes a very self-selecting sample.
That's what I'm thinking. It's not entirely random, obviously.
It isn't random, no.
It doesn't represent population centres. For instance, Cornwall has got like hundreds.
Exactly. What it represents is static populations.
Yeah. I mean, it gives a good idea of the extent to which any particular DNA group were existent, but it doesn't necessarily mean the kind of numbers that might be inferred from such a map.
No, it's completely separate, if you like, from the people who gave the samples are modern people.
Yeah.
But the
understandably.
No, because you can use ancient DNA.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't use ancient DNA in this sample, but although the people who gave the samples were modern, the pattern that they were trying to get at were people whose ancestors had remained in a specific area for a very, very long time. And what it does show is this massive input from North Germany. But on the other hand, this very, very disparate population pattern in the West and the North, where you get lots of communities who have clearly not moved a great deal. But I don't know, just in this, This is where the devil's in the detail, quite rightly, as you say, Matt, and why it bears greater analysis. It does show things that we do know. So you've got Northern Ireland and Southern Scotland with a yellow circle showing great affinities of population. We know that that happened in the prehistoric past. We know that it happened in the historic past. We know if you see this orange symbol here and here and here in southern Scotland, northern England, there is a known historic group called the Votadini, who at the time that we're talking about underwent familial-based migrations in and across these areas. So it's a map that bears enormous, enormous scrutiny. Sue, you've got your hand up very politely. Do go on. You must be on mute. So, Sue first. You need to unmute yourself, Sue. While you're trying to unmute yourself, can we go with Peter? Because Peter's got his hand up and he's not on mute. So, Peter, you go first.
It's just a little thought, really. I actually have a friend in York who took part in this.
Oh, wow.
And I've actually got his DNA profile. And the interesting thing is that they were looking for genetic markers, of course. And one of the things that is peculiar about Keith is that he has a disease. And it's a disease that only affects people from Scandinavia. And it's linked to their ancestry being, of course, from the Vikings. But so which part of Scandinavia, I don't know. But the disease was a tightening of the tendons in the hand that forces the hand to start bending towards a claw. And it's
capture.
Yeah, that's it. And it is something that is specific to the Scandinavians. And it was really quite useful because it was able to confirm something that Keith, who had been looking at his ancestry, had thought about, of where his genetic where his ancestors actually were. And if you were to see Keith, actually, if you put a pair of horns on his head, he would look like a Viking. And, you know, he would be great in a Game of Thrones. But it's interesting that they did look for these specific inherited traits that were marked within the DNA, which could enable them to locate somebody fairly specifically in their ancestry.
Marvelous. Thank you very much for that, Peter. Can we go, Sue, are you able to unmute yourself yet? Okay, Andrea, can you unmute yourself and go? You're still on mute.
Right. As you know, I do family history, etc. 3 of my grandparents are all from not a very wide distance from where I actually live and was born. My father's side is purely East Hampshire, from Alton south, just Sussex border. Literally, I am almost pure Anglo-Saxon, etc.
Wow.
According to my DNA, I am from this area, part of the world. I think I came across that study, but I have no access to any DNA on my dad's side of the family, so I was not eligible. But I have gone back as far as records allow me, and have traced my family history. And apart from one person who came from Staffordshire, everybody else is in this area. I am related to myself and all the other old families in this part of the world.
Fabulous.
All they did was move around from one little hamlet to the next as jobs took them. And I'm afraid this is me. So
Nothing to be afraid of there, Andrea.
and I'm linked to some Anglo-Saxon bits on the coast of East Anglia. And I also have DNA in common with the, what they call, oh heck, I've forgotten the name, in America, Blade,
Amish?
sorry?
The Amish? No.
No, we're
No.
looking at ancient,
Oh,
sorry, I'm having mental.
don't worry. It'll come back to you. You see,
Yes, it's the you know, the very ancient blades which are
oh, Clovis.
Clovis, that's
Yeah.
it. Yes, I'm related. So there you
Good.
go. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, lucky old you.
Well,
So do you want to go? Because you've got your hand up now.
Yes,
Andrew.
please. Yes. I'm sorry. I'm having all sorts of problems this morning. I'm actually on my husband's computer now because mine's decided it won't support Zoom. My question was, have any studies been done in Europe, any corresponding studies to explain why these people came over? Were they being pushed out of their area, so they had to move west? I mean, were these populations, are they also found, say, in France and Belgium and Holland, where they've moved over and sort of ended up with us because they had nowhere else to go?
Nowhere else to run.
Yeah.
We will actually look at that, Sue. It's
Okay.
maybe not answered fully with DNA, although there are large DNA similarities between Cornwall and Brittany, as well as linguistic similarities and known family contacts. Similarly, one of the frustrations with this study is that it ends at the boundaries of Northern Ireland, whereas we know histories tell us about contacts between Ireland and Wales and Cornwall happening in this period. We could do with that being backed up by DNA, but for reasons of their funding, I suppose, this study had to stop at the boundaries where it does. So we will cover that later in this session. So we'll come straight back to why these people move. Thank you, Sue. Matt?
Yeah, just one question which connects in with that. I remember from my history that there's a connection between the people in Cornwall and the Welsh and even further north. But in this map, it's showing quite a distinct difference between the Devon people and the Cornish. Why is that?
Right, that's coming to the heart of what the DNA pattern seems to suggest, which is that although these different levels of community, for example, via the church, via elite populations such as warrior kings or that kind of thing, these contacts happened and we know about them. In actual fact, the bulk of the population did not move very far. So you get these distinct populations arising. And so I often give the example in my family, which is my late sister-in-law, where those blue triangles are. My late sister-in-law came from that part of Yorkshire. And I well remember in the 1980s, Bradford and Bingley doing a big advert for their building society. And it involved a street with a woman on the street randomly turning round and looking into the camera. It's a beautiful, beautiful shot. She was an absolute spit of my sister-in-law. Facial features. And that is the kind of element that we're actually talking about. And you may have noticed it yourself, that you do, when you travel around parts of Britain, you do get physical and facial similarities happening in people. Well, red-headed people from Newcastle, straight nose, blue eyes, you know, these are not tropes, they're not made up, they are actually happening.
But,
It is an actual thing.
The reason why I ask is that my family are from Cornwall, mainly, but I remember what my grandfather and I think his brother even joked, oh, well, of course we did intermarry with the Devonish.
Oh, well,
So-
there is actually a distinct line.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
never realised how true
Yeah.
that was.
It is a thing, yeah, and that's the kind of thing that can happen. Let's move on. I'm glad you found it interesting. Thank you for your questions, everybody. And it doesn't stop there. No, why would it stop there? So it's not just DNA that's pointing us in a direction of a different type of arrival of new people than a mass attack and violence. One of them is language that reflects on what happened. And the map here, which is drawn by a splendid young man who runs an outfit called Starkey Comics, shows the language pattern that would have been common at the end of Roman Britain. So we're all speaking a kind of Celtic language. If we're posh, we will know a bit of Greek and Latin for dealing with the authorities, but most of the people aren't doing that. They're speaking this language, something like Welsh. In Ireland, they're speaking a different variant of the Celtic language, but it's broadly comprehensible to each other. Now, at the point of around 500, let's say, we're still mostly speaking the Celtic or Pictish or Irish Celtic languages. But in some pockets, we've got what we call in Britain Old English. So it's this language a bit like modern German. It's the language brought by new settlers. Then we get a pattern which persists right up to and beyond the Norman invasion of 1066, which is by 600, what have been a settler population have spread their language, and I'm using that carefully. The English language has spread and is occupying the eastern and southeastern quadrants of the islands, whereas in the other parts of the land, the languages haven't changed. And in fact, these archaic Cumbric, for example, was spoken in places like the Pennines until the 1100s. Archaic Welsh, Welsh, as you know, was deliberately stamped out after at the time of Edward II, or attempts were made to deliberately stamp it out. Archaic Cornish, Kerno was hung on by an absolute whisker in terms of language survival in the modern age. But there you can see it's still an important regional language. So I thought you'd find that of interest. Now, here's something else that is of interest in all of this picture. The incoming population did not write. They were not literate. They didn't come from a literate tradition. They had magical writing symbols, in other words, runes, but these were not used as a literate form of communication. They were used in symbolology, if there is such a word, rather than in writing. In the western and the northern parts of the islands, the connection with the Christian church meant that a form of writing had persisted, and the persistence of the Christian church protected that. So I hope you're seeing a picture there of how language shows a progression and changes, but are those changes always changes in whole populations? Possibly, possibly not. It's a complex thing. I look at the populations around where I live now, and many people arriving as speakers of foreign language foreign languages will adopt English for very specific purposes. Their children may grow up not being able to communicate in the old language. They're communicating in English, but they may not identify as English. It's complicated, but there we go. Thought you'd like that. Now, okay, so more about what the archaeology tells us though. And the archaeology tells us that one of the things people did, certainly in the West and the North, and possibly in other parts as well, is that they went back to the old ways. And what I'm showing you here on the picture is Cadbury Castle in Somerset, where there was a very famous large-scale dig in the 1960s and early 1970s. And this showed that people had gone back to living in this prehistoric, pre-Roman fortification. They'd gone back to living in it after the time that the Romans had disappeared. So from the 470s onwards, and they were building structures, they were reinforcing the defences. They built a vast hall of some kind, and they were having a good time. They had Mediterranean wine. We know this from the pottery, from the wine jars. So they weren't, that's not scrabbling about for a living, is it? That's, you know, that's going to have to cost something that had to be paid for somehow.
Yeah, they had chocolate as well, Maggie.
No, that's the wrong Cadbury. Stop it. No, no relation to Cadbury Birmingham can be inferred. But yes, they were not scrabbling about for a living. And this is what I mean about the retention of the Roman type writing. And here in this thing, you can see that it's combined with a different kind of writing as well. Thank you. So if you see on the side of this roughly shaped boulder, on the front it's got Roman writing and what looks like a cross inside a circle. On the side, it looks like somebody's whacked it a couple of times with either a knife or an axe or something like that. And that is actually writing. If you look, it's going up the side. It's a writing code that was used by people operating between Ireland and Wales, and it's known as Ogham. I'll show you some more Ogham in a moment. We get a lot of place names as well that is around the idea of churches or church communities. So you get Eccles or Eglwys in English and in Welsh. These seem to indicate these early Christian communities. You get lots of very shadowy early Christian saints, and I put a list there, everybody from Faith to Tidville, as in Method Tidville, Tidville the Martyr, and so on. And there's a particular cluster of these very, very early Christian grave markers to be found in and around Wales, and I've put a link there. So when you get these notes, you can follow it up for yourself. Another visible effect that's been detected by archaeology: building in stone fell away. It's almost as if every architect and every stonemason, and coincidentally everybody who owned a pottery wheel, got the first ships out when that message came in about not being part of the Roman Empire anymore. It was, right, lads, we'll not get any more work here. Come on, off we go. And after that point, architecture is wooden. Buildings are wooden. Even high-class buildings are wooden. Pottery is handmade and low-fired. And here, this is obviously a reconstruction. How did you guess? This is what was found by archaeologists and that is the wrong attribution at the bottom. I've just realised, so ignore it. This was a hall, a timber hall that was built partially across one of the inner roads of Birdoswald Fort on Hadrian's Wall. People were living there, some kind of community after the Roman Empire was living actually in the Roman fort of Birdoswald. And that's just one example. So how...
Maggie,
Oh,
Maggie, can I just,
you
Shah
can.
here. I'm a potter and my dad was a potter. So the correct term is hand built. Thrown means thrown on a wheel.
Thank you.
So you've got your terms slightly mixed up there. So
Thank you
hand
very
built,
much. Pottery was
coil
never
built.
like a throne
Yeah,
on a
but
wheel.
as soon as you say thrown, it means that it's
different
on
things.
a wheel.
I appreciate that. Thank you
Okay.
very much. And I stand corrected and will learn that. Excuse me. So how long did this go on for? Well, we can't be sure for a number of reasons. I'll tell you about the reasons in a minute, but I'll just show you this that was in that magazine. Current Archaeology has an online version called The Past, which you can obtain. And this is one of the articles I culled from it, showing a very looks as Roman as the one in the background in Linda's Linda T's Zoom image. It's got all the attributes of being Roman, but the dating evidence that surrounds it means it was made significantly after the time that we accept as the end of Roman Britain. So somebody was living a Romanized enough life in Gloucestershire long after, presumably, bureaucracy was either breaking down or broken down. Coinage was of limited value, and the old ways were just evaporating left, right, and centre. So they had a nice floor fitted. Well, why wouldn't you? There are things you can do, and things you can't do. And so that's one bit of dating evidence. Here's another interesting bit of dating evidence from Lincoln, where a present-day church, St Paul in the Vale, excavations there have shown that it was actually probably built in the Roman period and seems to have still been in use in the 450s. And it ties in with something that's known in one of the, I think it's in one of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entries, written obviously much later, and I've probably got the wrong attribution there, so don't quote me, but at the time of a terrible heresy that had to be stamped out, an Augustinian, somebody representing the Pope in Rome, let's put it that way, came on an official visit to Lincoln to make sure that they were doing things right in the church. And this person was met by somebody calling himself the prefect of the city, Praefectus Civitatis, the prefect of the city. So you've got something continuing. I mean, he may have been, you know, dressed in rags for all we know, but he believed he had some kind of Roman title. And I think that's of interest. And lastly on this theme, a little bit of evidence from Silchester. Angela, you will have a lot of information, I guess, about Silchester because that's on your patch, isn't it, more or less, near Reading. For the rest of us, Silchester, you probably know, is basically an interestingly shaped field. Roman Silchester was completely abandoned as a town and not lived in subsequently. Excuse me. And it's been excavated and excavated. Most recently, something like a 14 or 15-year excavation came to an end and is being written up by Professor Mike Fulford hopefully gets it all written up. And even with all of that, there is still no conclusion as to why Roman Silchester was abandoned. Go on, Andrea. Unmute yourself.
The most recent thing I read was that it had been on a direct Roman route from A to B, important places. And it's like when you put a bypass round, the route that was being used moved away. It was no longer an important place.
Makes sense.
You take away the roads, you've lost the town has then lost its trade. With the passing motorists.
Absolutely.
And it was basically redundant.
Passing donkey carts, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's as good a theory as any. It wouldn't explain why they built a thundering great wall around it, though, would it? Because if that move had been made, you wouldn't need to defend it anymore. But who knows? Thank you, Andrea. Sue, do you want to come in? Unmute yourself.
Yeah, this sounds very much the same as Wroxeter in Shropshire, which is where I live.
Oh.
It was shown Wroxeter was a big trading city in Roman times, and on one of the main north to south routes, and it did show that people lived there, continued to live there for a few hundred years, as the place just crumbled gently around them. But then it was completely abandoned. And although it had a massive baths and colonnaded shopping precincts, if you like, all that, apart from what was taken away to build other buildings, it was a huge area that now just sits in the middle of nowhere.
Perfect answer, yes. And I think we could cast a net over Britain, and I bet everybody in every region, if you thought about it and had a look, you'd find some kind of an abandoned Roman place. I'm thinking of or a much shrunk Roman place like Aldborough in Yorkshire. The problem, it's an easier problem to approach with these abandoned places. When you're looking at places which have remained good sites since the Roman period, so you look at London, you look at Colchester, you look at Manchester, you look at York, the layers of archaeology that would be giving us these answers about what happened in these very specific times, 400 to 600, let's say, those layers have mostly been taken away by subsequent development. And so it's a harder question. And it might be like so many things, it might be that there isn't one answer that fits all situations. So yes, so fascinating and so much to ponder, but definitely if we were looking at people who were chased out violently and killed, for example, what would we be finding archaeologically? Well, we'd be finding burning, we'd be finding dead bodies in horrible positions, but we're not. They're not finding that evidence in the archaeology. And so the lie is given to the sort of fire and brimstone. I'm just taking a look, Sue, I've got your message there, so right, just taking a look at chat there, so I'll catch up with those. Let's press on. Thank you for your questions, everybody. So pressing on, there we go. And the important point, we'll not dwell on it too long, but increasingly, a lot of sites which in past excavations, often quite distant past excavations, were dubbed prehistoric, may not be. They deserve going back and going over, because where careful careful and recent excavation has been possible, as in this example at Castle Henllys in Wales, it's quite clear that although they look prehistoric, they're not. People were living in them in the Roman times and after the Roman times. So we're getting the wrong message about how ordinary people lived. In the countryside, while all this Roman stuff had been going on, people in the countryside were just carrying on the way that they always had done. And I just find it quite interesting that the Roman word for a country dweller is paganos, a pagan. It shows you where the Christianity was building up, you see. It was an urban. Not for nothing that we have a pope called Pope Urban, but we don't have a Pope Pagan. Now, that would be something, wouldn't it? Right. Now, actual archaeological evidence for these Germanic mercenaries is very hard to decode because they look mostly like anybody else. It's easier now with DNA. When mucking in Essex, which was destined to be extracted in one big lump of gravel, till people waded in and got it protected as an ancient monument. At mucking in Essex, they found the first evidence that seems to suggest a Germanic population living alongside a late Romanized population. And because of the way the deceased of this Germanic population were buried, the excavators have suggested that these may have been some of these Germanic mercenaries and their families living nearby as the heavy troops, making sure nobody who shouldn't be there got up the Thames estuary and bothered them. Sounds familiar to nowadays, doesn't it? It's the equivalent of Canby Island, I suppose. Just why aren't we hearing more about mucking? Well, this massive dig, in its time, it was the biggest dig happening in Britain, which lasted over a decade. And no funding was ever put into it, post-excavation work. So the post-excavation work is still going on piecemeal, using the excellent records left behind by the excavators. Jill, please go ahead.
Yes, just going back really quite a way, but it sort of might be relevant to this. When you were talking about DNA, I think it was Matthew, was it? A friend of his had this problem with his hands becoming like claws, right? One of my aunts and one of my grandfathers on my mother's side both had this problem. Now, my daughter has had one of these DNA tests done, and she has got Norwegian in her DNA.
Whoa. Woo-hoo.
So that is interesting for us as a family.
It is.
Nobody else has got it. Touching wood, it appears to have died out. But, you know, it's a confirmation that was a Scandinavian thing, at least.
Absolutely. It's always of interest, if you can, with the family record, to see in the more recent past whether any of your ancestors lived near a seaport.
Right.
Because friendly interactions, shall we say, with visiting merchants, were often an interesting source of new family members. But yes, wow, goodness me, how interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting, but you know, for me anyway, it's, you know.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jill.
Okay.
So here is an example of one of those things that you see in a museum and you think, why have I come here? Because there'll be a row of these in a case and it doesn't really tell you very much at all. Suffice it to say that these are one of a type. If I do that, it probably cheers it up a bit. Ah, there you go. That's why they were wearing it, because it was really blingy. It was gilt bronze, so it would have been shiny, shiny and lovely. And that's why people wanted to wear it. This type of fashion originated on the borders of the Roman Empire on the continent. And if you go particularly to the National Museum in Budapest, as you do, you can see wonderful examples of the kind of hybrid fashions that the borderlands people invented using Roman styles and their own preferences, and a whole new way of fashion sprouted. And the problem is that Roman people also said, oh, that's pretty, I'm having me one of those. And that's what I mean about this highly Germanic style buckle. So you can see it's got wiggly sea creature animals, it's got a particular interlace, it's got hidden human faces if you look into it, all of the hallmarks, facing beasts and all this kind of thing, all of the hallmarks, but the overall shape is just a bog standard Roman military buckle of the time, but then it's been added to and tweaked. So I'll just pass on with that, because these are the tiny pixels of information that the pictures of archaeology are made up from, these tiny differences. Now, I haven't got a picture for this one that I'm going to just talk you through very, very briefly, but this is a more recent excavation that's been heavily based around DNA recovery. And this was near Brighton, I think I'm right in saying, yes, Buckland. Is that Brighton or is it Dover? Correct me. But the group that were excavated, it was one of these great instances where rather than a narrow part of an area, they've been able to do quite a large excavation and recover, they think, if not all, then most of the people who were buried in what appears to have been a Saxon cemetery. And in the timeline of who was buried there, what they have found is that the original people, if you read the report, it says that their DNA falls in with CNE. In other words, continental North European. In other words, Germanic. So the people, the oldest people interred in this cemetery were Germanic. And later, a woman who was married, a woman who was buried in this cemetery and whose two daughters were buried in this cemetery. The woman had clearly grown up in the Western British Isles, so she's some kind of Celtic person, and her two daughters their father must have been one of the Germanic group, because the daughters have both types of ancestry. And this process is repeated later on in subsequent generations, where, let's call it, I've called it in inverted commas, a bride has been brought into the group and has a family with one of the men, and the children are of dual ancestry. Now, why would I put bride in inverted commas? We don't know the circumstances, do we? She might have been a purchased slave. She might have been a runaway. I'm going to be awful here and say she might have been the nanny. It happens, but we don't know. So we can't put our beliefs into that. All we know is the science of it, which is that however she came into the family group, or however those two women came into the family group, they, at the time of burial, were treated with equal status. Again, that doesn't account for their whole life journey. There's that very, very famous gravestone, Roman gravestone from Sunderland of Regina, in all of finery. It's in the Hancock Museum, the Great North Museum in Newcastle. In fact, no, at the moment it's in London, Discovering the Legions exhibition at the British Museum. She's in all of finery, and you read the text, and she is a freed woman. In other words, she started life as a slave. So, you know, the appearance doesn't necessarily give the whole story. It does in that instance. In this instance, we don't have anything like a monument or writing to back up the story. So I thought I'd just show you that as a recent example. Right, pottery. Hand built, not thrown. Thank you, Shah. I've got it right this time. Hand built pottery, low fired, looking like nothing on earth. Another Germanic feature are these holes in the ground. Now, everything that you see above the holes in the ground is imaginary. Imaginary houses have been built on top of them. These reconstructions are done by people who spent lifetimes studying what these holes in the ground could mean. But what you find in these early Germanic settlements, both in the British Isles and on the continent, are these smallish buildings with a sunken floor. And so because they're found on the continent, they get given a Germanic name, which is a Grubenhaus. Andrea, do go ahead.
In my far distant youth, I came across the term grub house. Could this be connected, looking at the word at the bottom?
I guess, yeah, I think so. Sounds like it. So we aside from the fact that it's all imaginary, hypothetically, why might you build a structure starting by digging a hole in the ground and then putting support posts for the rest of the structure into that?
Drainage?
Storage.
Drainage. I think they're both relevant. They're both feasible. I only know that where I live, and the soils are very clayey, if you were to dig a hole in the ground like that, it would very quickly become an indoor swimming pool.
Yeah.
A very cold, muddy indoor swimming pool. So if this is a tradition that's arisen on certain soil types, you could buy that. So you think steppe soil, great North European soil, free draining. You could buy that. That's drainage. That might work. Storage, definitely. You know, you put things in the cellar, keep them cool. You can buy that. They're all hypothetical. Ultimately we don't know, and ultimately we don't know what these look like above the ground either. So I'm just saying Grubenhaus, sunken floored houses. Other things that we see distinctive funerary practices, and how people choose to bury their dead is a very important cultural marker. What's noticeable about these Germanic groups is, if you just pop yourselves on mute, folks, if you've got something going on in the background. Very, very noticeable is that initially, at least, many of them appear to prefer cremation. And the environment that they were coming into in Britain was an environment that no longer used cremation. In past times then, that's been used as a broad identifier in archaeology. If you find a body that's cremated at this period, it must be a pagan Saxon. If you find a body that's inhumed, not burned, that must be a Romanized Christian. You've seen the flaw in that straight away, haven't you? Which is, you're assuming a one size fits all, and you can never do that, because we know how random and wonderful people are. People do all sorts of unique things. This lovely little tiny statue made on top of a pot lid, it's in the Norfolk Museums, is completely unique. And I think it's the only actual face of a depiction of a person of this period that exists in Britain. Go on, Sue. Unmute yourself.
You said that even during the Roman period, life in the country went on as it had for many, many years. And do you think that obviously their old practices and things like that would have continued as well? So
Absolutely.
yeah,
absolutely. It's often commented that we simply don't know how the Pagani, the people in the countryside, buried the dead. For the most part, we don't know. And it might be that they were using very, very ancient practices like exposure, you know, like North American Indians did on a kind of an outdoor sort of bed. It could have been that they were cremating people. We simply don't know for the greater part. Yeah, and people would have just carried on. So we don't know. We have to be very careful nowadays with excavations. Is what time period are we looking at? What's the whole context? You can't. If you make assumptions, you're leading yourself down a false path initially. I'm just showing you, and I hope that you can pick out on the right-hand side there, one of the distinctive knives that accompany very often burials or gifts in the grave at this time and mark out Germanic people, which is this kind of almost like a carving knife. It's not a double-edged knife, it's a single-edged knife. The handle is gone on this one. This one was found, I think, in the River Thames in the 1850s, so it's got no real context. But what's unusual about this one is that it has runes scratched on the blade. And you do find this very occasionally. And it's something that J.R.R. Tolkien built on in his mythologies and his stories, which was the idea of magic knives and magic swords with a name, you know. I'm not sure what's on this, but apparently somebody has decoded parts of the runic to say Begnoth or Biagnoth, however you might pronounce that. So you get these, the pottery, the houses, the way of burying, the type of knife that you carry, all distinctive. The type of jewelry that you wear, the purpose of this jewelry is twofold. One is it stops your clothes falling off. So everything's pinned on nice and firmly. The other, well, you tell me, it's not just holding your clothes on, is it? What else is it doing? It's showing your...
Advertising wealth.
Exactly. It's showing your status. It's advertising your wealth, showing your standing. So you've got, as with all things like that, you've got two things going on. They're not just functional, and in some cases, they're crazily not functional, because some of these square-headed brooches get very, very top-heavy. Excuse me. So it begs the question of how they were actually used, whether they were things that were simply laid in the grave of the recipients, and so on. And you get this love of interlace happening, and some fantastic detail, for example, the doves in this one. So, and you can spend your life, I've put a link there for you, you can spend your life just looking at early types of Anglo-Saxon jewellery. We're not even on to the really beautiful stuff yet that comes in after the 600s. Go on, Jill.
Yeah, sorry, what are these made of?
Right. I think that the one on the left is made of gilt bronze, and I think the one on the right is, I'd have to check actually. Let's just have a quick look, see if it tells us. Silver.
Okay.
Yeah. So with all of these, if you just click on the link, then it will tell you more about the artifact. I'm just going to check chat. Oh, Matt's in pain. Poor Matt's had to leave in pain. Pulled a muscle. Poor man. Distinctive types of jewellery and distinctive luxury goods, such as these glass vessels. And these are pretty rare. Not everybody got these. The production of glass, like everything else that was mass produced before the 400s, after the 400s, the production of glass plummets. And the people who were able to make glass were very few and far between. It is believed that many of the pieces that you see here were actually imported from the Frankish continent in the 400s or 500s, where more glassworking continued. Just very, very briefly, but the same economic collapse did not happen at the same pace in continental Europe as happened in Britain. And so many of the forms of living, like mass production and urban living, carried on for a much longer time on continental Europe. So we really were, after the Roman Brexit, we really were the poor relations. Let's not get too topical about that in the present age, because we'll just end up upset. So I think somebody's got a background sound going on. If you're trying to ask a question, yell very hard, otherwise.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Daniela?
Yeah.
Go on, yell. You're a bit faint.
Cups, etc. Not intended to be set on the base.
I'm not picking up what you're saying. Is anybody able to pick up?
In the chat. All right.
Okay. Yeah, write it in the chat and I'll come back to it now. I'll wait till it appears while I talk about these kind of beads.
Okay.
So time and again, and we're just waiting for Daniela's question to appear in the chat. If any of you see it in your chat before it appears in mine, then do yell it out at me. But one of the features that's seen time and again in both as gifts in graves, be they burial or cremation, or these type of beads made of glass, made of stone, often made of very, very old objects. I don't know if you can see a lovely blue bead there. Well, that's actually Roman. That must have been picked up or found or passed on in a family. This one here as well, this is a Roman melon bead. And so there seems to be a love of this multicoloured jewellery, often with ancestral ancestral connections perhaps. So Daniela was saying, palm cups, etc. are not intended to be set on the base. Excellent point. Let's go back and look at them. So whoopsie-daisy, that was the wrong way to go. So thank you, Danielle, for pointing that out. None of these would have stood upright on their own. You're absolutely right, Danielle. Well spotted. And any supports that you can see have been made by museums to stop them falling over in the case, so they can display them safely. So it begs the question, what would you be using to set something down firmly on a base? Well, you'd be using a table. And a successful table requires a level floor. And if your floor in your wonderful wooden hall is made of stamped earth and some rushes to keep it nice and warm, it's likely not to be very level. So a table is likely not to be a very functional thing, not a table as we would understand it. So you are going to either hang on to your beautiful things, or you're going to actually have them slung from something. you know, like you see pictures of people with these horn drinking cups actually slung on a thong around them. Go on, Andrea.
Sorry.
You've muted yourself.
Okay, just another little thought on that. These items are fairly high status. So one would have one's people to look after one.
Absolutely. You certainly would. Yeah. And I wouldn't like to be the person that drops one, would you? I doubt that there would be much sympathy shown. Yes.
Can I just say, when I was working in Norway and also growing up in Scotland, there were quite a lot of myths around. I mean, I don't know what basis they are, but people would say, oh yes, they didn't have a stand to put these things down because it was unmanly to stop drinking until it was empty. And then you would just turn it upside down if you'd finished drinking, or you'd just keep it in your hand until you couldn't take any more, and then you'd fall over.
Yes.
So I mean, I've heard that quite a few times, both in Norway and in Scotland, but obviously both very heavy drinking.
And you're absolutely right, though, Shah. And the other thing is, we're assuming that these might be used by one person, whereas in fact, they might be communally passed around with a complete disregard for health and safety. And many people, hi Sarah, many people might be sharing from the same posh cup. And if you put that into a context like a Christian chalice, you start to perhaps see a dimension beyond a drinking culture, but it might have been a drinking culture. So we've got all sorts of dimensions of human activity that we can sort of talk about with these objects. So glass beads, we've done glass beads. Just taking a look at chat again. Yeah, Daniela. So Daniela, are you happy now with how those were used or how they might have been used? Hope we've answered your question. Come back to me on chat if not. Okay. And don't be shy about it. Now, if you like your UFO stories, and shout out if you do, then you'll know that Rendlesham is important, not just for archaeology. Go on, who knows? The Rendlesham incident. Da, da, da. I'm not sure of the date. One of my students in another wrong word, members in another group knew it straight away. But let's call it late 1950s, early 1960s. A group of American airmen attached to the nearby airbase had an eerie experience that has engendered, if you Google the Rendlesham incident online, you'll get all sorts of results and explanations run from visitations by alien aircraft to the Orford Ness lighthouse, to all points in between. It's never been satisfactorily replied to. Anyway, ignoring the UFOs, recent excavations have shown the remains of a large timber building that was not lived in. Now, how might we know that a large timber building wasn't lived in?
Didn't have a fire.
No central hearth. And as you're cooking round that hearth, what might be happening? There's going to be lots of
Chat.
lots of stuff going on, isn't there? Drop bones and drop bits of pottery and stuff ground into the floor, because once something's fallen into the rushes on one of these floors, you're not going to be rooting after it for fear of what else you might find in there. You're going to leave things to settle down on their own in that. So you get what's called an occupation layer, which is all the stuff that people have stamped on and dropped and lost and everything else, stamped into the floors of buildings like this. There's no occupation layer. So it's a big building that hasn't been used for occupation. It's been used, but not for occupation. What we do have from the writings of the Venerable Bede, and it's broadly contemporary with the dates coming back for this building, is that Redwald, one of the great kings of East Anglia, Saxon kings, had a temple built at Rendlesham that had altars to Odin and Thor and Christ. And that's written in the History of the Ecclesiastical Church and People, something like that. Bede's writings. Is this what we're looking at? What would be the chances of actually hitting the actual spot that that Radwald built? It's an interesting thought, totally unproven, but in archaeology, when you can't explain something, you call it ritual. So we've got a ritual building to explain away. Explain it at your peril. There we go. And I've put some references there that some of you might like to follow up and have a read of if you're ever having difficulty sleeping. There you go. All sorts of things that you can follow up there. But one of the questions asked right at the beginning, I'm just taking a look at chat again. Thank you, Daniela. I appreciate that. One of the questions asked by Sue at the beginning was, what was happening then? Why were these people impinging on this, making this difficult journey over to the British Isles when they could have stayed where they were? And the simple answer is that these groups were seeking to settle. And I know this is sounding familiar. Let's not pretend the present day, let's pretend the present day isn't happening. Let's pretend we're all in the past and nothing can harm us. Okay, because we can't go down that line, can we? Now, basically, what we're looking at, though, is that what happened, we have to gaze at this, that what happened in Britain after the Roman Empire was part of something that had been going on for a much longer time all across continental Europe. And if we just put what we know about and what we've been talking about in this session, which is people called Angles and Saxons and Jutes, and we're not wholly clear about where they came from, but I've just put some broad lines on the map there to represent it. Put them into the context of what was happening across the rest of the place on the continent. So we've got the Franks. That's the journey that they made. That's why we call that area France. Now, the Frankish kingdom was carved out of Roman Gaul. We've got the Burgundians, an actual group who make a journey from the island of Bornholm and end up being granted territory in the middle of modern day France. We've got the Visigoths. Well, hey, the Visigoths, there they go. We can spend a whole series on the Visigoths if you want some fun and games with people on the move. And they're close but not very close associates, the Ostrogoths. They're charging all over continental Europe. And we've got other groups like the Vandals and the Alans. And these are only the few main groups. There were hundreds of them. We can go into Gepids, we can go into Suebi, we can go into all sorts of peoples on the move. And these peoples were on the move, but had been buffered up for a very long time by the River Danube and the fact that it represented the official border of the Roman Empire. So the River Danube and then the Rhine and the Meuse, representing the official borders of the Roman Empire. And they were not being granted permission to settle until the point where they couldn't be prevented any longer. Why did that happen then? Why didn't they just live contented lives along the borders? Why did they feel the need to bust in and settle? Well, they were driven. And they were driven on the one hand by opportunity. So in our part of the world, with lots of sea lanes, piracy, back to the beginning where we looked at those forts with the big bastions that could fling rocks at visiting pirates, stealing goods, stealing people to sell on as slaves. That was big business. But even bigger was what was happening to the east. And that was a massive movement of these people known as the Huns. We don't know really what they called themselves, but they were not seeking to settle. A bit like ISIS, it's political, this essay, I suppose, in the modern age, a bit like the movement that ISIS made across the Middle East in the years before COVID. They were not seeking to settle. And we see this with the Huns. They were not seeking to settle. They were seeking goods, valuable metals, slaves. They were seeking to be paid off and make it worth our while to return. But the impact that they had on people in the way was significant. And even the rumour of Hun movement was enough to set people scuttling across the face of Europe. And this created a domino effect of pressure that when people were no longer able to defend their borders, then resulted in occupation being possible. Sue, if you're still with us, does that help to answer the query that you had at the beginning of the session? I think
Yeah,
Sue.
I mean that sounds perfectly reasonable to me. It's people escaping, getting out of the way, and also there's that nice little island that the Romans were always going on about. Let's try over there, isn't it? It's because
Absolutely.
we were quite a valuable source of resources, weren't we, at the time? Yeah, so nice.
There for the taking.
Yeah, lovely climate, not too hot, not too cold. I can see that being very popular. Yeah,
not too near the Huns as well, because one of the things the Huns did not do was build ships.
Wonderful. Yes, that'll do. Yeah, I did find a little bit with the what were called the Vikings later on, that they expanded into other parts of Europe purely because there was no land for them, that they had to seek if they wanted to settle or thrive, that they had to look elsewhere because they had very few resources in their own country.
Brilliant. Yeah, we'll look at the Vikings separately, and they're quite different in that they aren't actually a population movement like this is.
No.
Just as an aside to point out the similarities, Britannia had no defences after the 400s, or very, very scant, very few. So it was an easy target. The other places that had very few defences, where legions weren't considered necessary throughout the Roman period, was Spain and North Africa. And look at how swiftly and comprehensively the Visigoths and the Vandals and Alans took those places. They simply romped through them. And we'll look at another time at this whole, they actually created quite vibrant kingdoms and entities all of their own that were there right up to the Arab Muslim invasions of the 600s, 700s. So I thought that you'd like to see that slide, and I hope it's helped to contextualize what Britain went through at this particular time. Oh yes, there it is. Domino effects of Hun incursions. That sums it up. It's like a crossword clue, that isn't it? Okay. Oh, I put that there. That was really quite wrong of me, I suppose. But I think at the end of the day, in all seriousness, we can't avoid drawing comparisons with the situation in Western Europe and in North America now, and accepting that this is not just a global issue, but it's a historic issue as well. This has always been going on at different times in history. And I'm sure our parents and grandparents' generation would have started talking about refugees at the end of 1945 and so on. So a perennial problem that has never been solved when very poor, desperate people clash against the borders of very rich, comfortable cultures. Here's
Maggie,
another thing. Go on,
Maggie,
shout.
it's Shah here. That's why the Radio 4 programme, The Long View, is so effective, because it takes it. He starts off with a sentence or two that sounds exactly like a current situation, either in Britain or somewhere else. And then they zoom back in history and say, this is exactly what was going on, 2000 years ago or 600 years ago or whatever. And I think that makes people who aren't that interested in history sit up and take note, because of those modern parallels. So thank you for the modern parallel.
Oh, right. Well, I'm glad it's not caused offence and upset. Mary is just asking in chat. So the Huns were a mix of protection, racketeers, and genocide. Yeah, it's certainly the effect that they had on people. It's still unclear, very unclear, why the Huns ever went on the move in the way that they did. They were doing exactly the same in China. They were also extremely successful, and there is nothing like being extremely successful to give you a bad press in history by the people who write history. The Huns did not write. We can do a section on the Huns if you wish. Ooh, boy, can we talk about Huns. We did do it with the people who've been in this group longer. We did do a session on the Huns about 18 months ago, I think, possibly less than that. But we can revisit that at any time. Mary also says, climate change will be the next big driver of mass migration. Yeah, it always was, because it's likely to have been climate change that set the Hun horseback steppe people on the move in the first place. So there's a very, very long and terrifying history of climate change that we uncover via archaeology. The other interesting one is, as you see here, a very long and interesting history of pandemics. And Justinian's plague in the 500s was definitely one of the things that's affected many, many places. You might be tempted to think that Britain, being an island, would have been safe. Its economy's collapsed. You've got no reason to go there, no money to trade with, or at least very little. So how would plague get there? And so, indeed, but it did. And this is where forensic archaeology, so looking at DNA, looking at evidence of past illnesses and so forth, helps, because here we've got an absolute example from Eddix Hill. I don't know if I pronounced that. On the south, I think that's on the south coast, where a whole community in the 500, the middle part of the 500s, died of some kind of bubonic plague, Justinian's plague. And it goes to show that the written sources that talk about the plague spreading from Egypt, then round the Mediterranean, is only partial, because clearly people were moving and contaminating each other, moving along different routes that aren't documented in the the late antique sources that have been relied on in the past. So just looking at chat again, slaves keep getting a mention, thank you, Jeff, and seem to have been around for a very long time. Yes, and slavery has been around longer than it has not been around. So we cannot avoid it. Yes, absolutely. Pope Gregory, well known for his terrible faux pas, what we see as a historic faux pas now, referring to, I'm just going to skip that slide, referring to blonde people being sold as slaves in the markets of Rome. And when, go on, what did he say when he was asked, who are they? He was told they were
Angels.
He said, yes, that's right. They are angles, your very poperiness, whatever his title was. He was told, and he quipped back, they are not angles, but angels, and should be taking their rank among those in heaven. What? Just give them the freedom, man, you know. But that didn't occur to them. It was all rather jolly and witty that they were slaves. Different times, yes, slavery. That's why people didn't live very near coastlines, folks, because you get nabbed as a slave. And that's right up to Shakespeare's time.
And beyond. Maggie,
yeah,
and beyond, because my family came from just the back of Portsmouth, and we've got this story which has come down the line that somebody was walking home, and they kept the oh God, what they're called, you know, the guys who took the people and made them
press gang.
Press gang came, yes. Right. So the story goes that he hid in the ditch and evaded them. So it's the same sort of thing, really, isn't it?
Absolutely is. Yes, goodness me, lucky guy. Yeah. I'm just going to finish off with superb forensic archaeology. The first real time that this was practiced in Britain. And this is the excavation led initially by Basil Brown at Sutton Hoo, where Mrs. Edith Pretty wanted an interesting large mound on her land looked at. And so tell me what you're looking at in the picture. What's in the ground there? What can you see? What's it look like?
Ribs of a boat.
The ribs of a boat. Exactly.
It's the ghost that's left impression that's been left behind in the sand.
Thank you, Andrea. And
That'd be like a fossil.
Not quite a fossil, Jill. Technically, fossils are material that's been compacted for 10,000 years or more.
Oh, okay.
In this instance, had there been no disturbing of the ground for the next couple of million years, this might have created a fossil, only might. What we're looking at, as Andrea mentioned, is actually the tiny frail ghost of a ship, because what Basil Brown taught his diggers to work around were the different coloured stains in the sandy soil that were caused where timber had rotted and where timber had not rotted. And so what you see is nothing more than sandy soil, but it's sandy soil of different colours, and you can see how the rivets, the iron rivets used by the ship builders, have all been carefully exposed, and they were mapped and plotted. And you see, none of those ribs, none of that marking will survive in the soil. That's gone now. Excavation is destruction. You destroy it when you dig it out. But what Basil Brown did was using photography and using meticulous recording. He recorded everything that was there. He got people not to just pull out the metal bits and go, oh, look, metal. He taught them to record exact locations. And so they've actually been able to reconstruct the ship, which was a seagoing ship, as a result. And in the central part where the blokes are here, you can see there's a blank area. And because the archaeology of this was so complex, and because it was on the eve of war, what was done with this was the entire block was taken out in careful sections and taken away to laboratories to be slowly and carefully excavated in forensic laboratory conditions. And that's why we know so much about the circumstances of the Sutton Hoo burial and the wonderful treasures and other objects and other customs and practices associated with it. And I've just done a screen grab there of the kind of thing that we're talking about, because what we'll do next time, if you don't mind, is we'll take a look at these, for want of a better word, let's call them princely burials. Find a lot of them around the southeast, including one near Aldi in South, Southend-on-Sea, that's it, Brittlewell.
Oh, yeah.
And we'll have a look at all of these, and we will revel both in the amazing beauty of what has been discovered, but also at the range of contacts that information will show us. Now, what I'm going to do, because this has got quite long, I'm just going to stop the recording